My name is Grant Martin. I am the network coordinator for the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network. Welcome to this month's webinar for June 2025, Changing the Narrative, Building Community Support for Shelters. Now, I want to start with an apology of saying if you've seen today's session change titles a couple times or in different ways, and either on the LinkedIn page or the Facebook group page, or when I send it out via email, my apologies for that. Part of it is, I think, because we started out with an intention for today's session to be heavily or almost entirely focused on like strategies for engagement with the media. And then as we were planning this out, we realized that we need to make it a bit broader, that the topic is more broad than just media engagement and changing the narrative through our relationship with our local media, but then also about influencing our neighbors, businesses, residents, things like that. So we broadened the topic a bit and reflect that in the title, where we changed it to Building Community Support for Shelters. So welcome. I want to start by providing a land acknowledgement. For me, I'm situated in what is known as, colonially known as London, Ontario. I acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Lenape, and the Attawandarons people. I honor and respect the history, languages, and cultures of the diverse Indigenous people who call this territory home, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and play on this land. But I also want to acknowledge too that the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network is a national network. And so from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And I subscribe to land acknowledgements by personally stating what I can do as a treaty person. And I encourage others to seek learning and discourse about Indigenous communities. Those who learn, please share, and please ensure we are sharing truth. I aim to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into my professional practice when appropriate and approach it with humility. Next slide. Just a few housekeeping items as we get started. One is I believe that everybody's muted, but in case you're not, just make sure that you are muted on your end, just to keep down the background noise. Attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. Our format is that we're going to have 60 minutes approximately for the presentation, and then the final 30 minutes of our 90-minute session will be Q&A. Doesn't mean that you have to wait until the Q&A session to pose your question. If you want to, you can type it into the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentation. Please don't put your questions in the please don't put your questions in the chat box, because that will be used for different things. Please make sure that your questions go into the Q&A box. Common question that folks will ask is, will the slides and this session recording be available following today? Yes, I will make sure that it gets emailed out to all registrants, typically within about a week following the session. But also, just so you know too, at any time, you can always go and look at the CSTN website at transformshelter.ca under the webinar page to find all the links to previous webinars. So it's hosted there as well. We have 90 minutes for today's session. I'm pretty bad at, I'm pretty good at consistently going over that time. So I'm going to try a bit better to like stay within it for today. Because 90 minutes, it's a journey. So I don't want to go longer than that. I appreciate you committing the time that you have for today's session. Next slide. So our webinar series, we have an aim, a few aims of what we're trying to achieve through this monthly series that we host. One is that we really want to, first and foremost, help strengthen our shelter services across the country by helping find ways to present material that will improve housing outcomes for the individuals that you support in your shelters. Hopefully the work that we're doing in these webinar series too will help you feel like as if you have greater alignment within your shelter with your broader community's goals for the community in which you're situated in. Everything that we're doing too is about trying to push forward around how we can support your shelter with becoming more housing focused in your approach. and really be able to maximize the ways that we can help influence shelters to be clear around service expectations for their shelter guests, wherever they may seek shelter, right? So trying to develop um, a way of creating some consistency for shelter guests and their experiences in shelters across the country so they know what to expect for types of service and expectations of them when they go into that space, whether it's in Windsor, Ontario or Kelowna, BC. Okay, next slide. So this is just a brief outline for today. I can see I already made a mistake there. I still have the old title for our session in there. So just a good reminder that even when we have the best strategy, we still make mistakes and we just keep moving forward. But it's all about changing the narrative today. We have 3 presenters joining us, and then we will have time for questions from attendees at the end after the presentation. Next slide. But I also do want to highlight why we do these things is to really help achieve the mission of CSTN, right? And CSTN, if you're not that familiar with us, we are a network of homeless shelter leaders and organizations across Canada that are really committed at making our emergency shelters more housing focused, because we see the essential roles that shelters play and helping a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness become housed. And we are a big driver for helping end homelessness in Canada. But I also want to take a moment to like give a little bit of background around how CSTN came to be and how the housing focus approach came to be. Um, I want to recognize that this housing focused shelter model has deep roots. CSTN's work today builds on the innovation of people like Org Code Consulting and the courage of a small group of emergency shelters in the US and Canada that were early adopters of this approach. Going back more than 10 years, Orco's evaluations uncovered a key problem. What they found was that many shelters were unintentionally prolonging people's experiences of homelessness by focusing on programming over permanent housing. And what they found in the data was very clear. There were very few exits from shelter to housing. And when it did happen, it was due to perhaps luck or the individual's personal resilience, not necessarily because of the support that was offered in the shelter. From this, OrgCode introduced a new approach that prioritized those shelter guest strengths over deficits, and housing as the primary outcome for people that are accessing shelter. So a clear break too from a more compliance-driven sheltering model. So shelters like Crossroads in Rhode Island and the LA Family Housing piloted the model, proving it could work. And by 2016, dozens of shelters had joined the shift. And by 2017, the term housing focused shelter was formalized. And this is where CSTN's efforts today are built on. They're built on this foundation, right? Our success would not be possible without the leadership of OrCode and those early adopter shelters who reimagined what shelter could be. And we honor that legacy today by continuing to put housing at the center of everything that we do. And so next slide. With that in mind, with our mission in mind and our history in mind, it really shapes how we at CSTN can assist you as shelter operators with making these transitions to being more housing focused in your approach. And we do this in a few different ways. One is through the webinar series, such as this one that we host on the last Wednesday of each month at 12 noon Eastern time. We also have a self-assessment tool to figure out how aligned you currently are with the housing focus approach or not, and where there might be areas of further growth. You can find that on the CSTN website under our resources tab. But the other is that we share a whole heck of a lot of tools that have been developed by other shelter providers that are hosted on our website under the resources page. And so I want you to think about, as you're making that shift to being more housing focused or lower barrier, don't feel like as if you need to create everything from scratch. There may be some of your peers across North America that have already done some of this work that you can either adopt or make adaptations from those things. So look to the resources page that's on the website at transformshelter.ca, and you'll see the arrows there that show those tabs for the resources and also the webinars. But to go back to, sorry, to 2 slides back to support how can we assist, you'll notice too on this page that there's a QR code. If you have the camera on your phone, please feel free to scan that image. And it will bring you to a link that will allow you to be able to register for a free membership, and you can decide how passive or active you are in your membership with CSTN. Okay, that's it. So now we'll move forward over to our upcoming webinar series. So you'll see for next month's topic, it is titled Holding the Line with Heart, so trauma-informed de-escalation in shelters. We know that staff in emergency shelters regularly navigate high stress situations where tensions can escalate quickly. And so this webinar, its aim is to offer practical trauma-informed strategies for recognizing, one, early signs of agitation, but then two, being able to respond to escalating behaviors and then maintaining safety for both shelter staff and guests. So in this session, we're gonna explore real world scenarios and reflect on the impact of power dynamics and triggers and learn how to respond with empathy, clarity, and confidence. Next slide. Okay, so I'm wrapping up here. I want to first take a moment before I introduce our speakers to do a bit of a Slido poll. There's 2 ways that you can participate. If you have your phone and your camera handy, you can scan the QR code on your screen, or you can always just enter into your browser, slido.com, and enter the number that's there. And this polling question is really simple. So which one of these best describes you? Or I guess not which one, select all that apply. So feel free to take a moment to kind of just complete the poll if you're able to. So we get a sense of kind of who's in the room with us. Okay. So it looks just about an even split between folks who are shelter operators and folks who work elsewhere in housing and homelessness sector, but maybe work with people experiencing homelessness, but outside of the shelter. Some folks are advocates for shelters. We have some funders, and then we have a small number who are folks who are just interested in the topic, which is great. Okay. Okay. Thank you for completing that poll. That gives a good sense for us of who's in the room today. So today's speaker. As I introduce today's speaker, I want to just highlight why we landed on this topic for today. At the most recent national conference hosted back in the fall of last year, CSTN, we hosted an Ask Me Anything session with shelter operators from across the country, and what we heard was very concerning, and sadly, probably not news to anyone here in this virtual room today. We heard that operators were increasingly losing the support of the media, the public, and even fellow service providers within their community. And instead of being seen as kind of like a compassionate, essential response to homelessness shelters, and by extension, their staff and their guests, are too often being portrayed as the problem. So a lot of folks describe the experience of losing control over the public narrative and the image of their shelter. And so with that meant the humanity of their work and of the people they support was being eroded. So operators spoke of feeling actually quite vilified in their communities, with damaging stories eclipsing the story of their work. Their work is that they are showing up every day to provide safety, dignity, and support in the face of a housing and systems crisis. And so since that conversation, CSTN has been hearing more and more of the same from shelter operators. Because we work in a time when public opinion can shape policy funding and community trust, how shelters are portrayed in the media and by the public matters more than ever, because we're at a really critical point. So if we want to shift public opinion and really reclaim our stories and protect the dignity of the people we serve, we need to get better at shaping the conversation and changing the narrative. So that brings us to today's session. And with that, I feel like I'm incredibly grateful to have such knowledgeable and experienced speakers joining us today, people who understand not only the media landscape, but the heart of this work. So joining us today, we have Jara Dodge. Jara is the communications lead from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Cindy Titus Cindy is the communications manager with Main Street Project in Winnipeg. And then also with us today is Darren Nodrick, the Director of Development with Silent Mission, which is also located in Winnipeg. So with that, thank you and welcome to all of you, and I'll pass it over from here to Jara.
Great. Thanks so much, Grant, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I am glad we had good participation in that first poll. We'll have a few more as we go on. As Grant mentioned, my name is Jara Hodge, and I'm the communications lead at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Just for anyone who's not familiar with us, we are a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness. Our organization works directly with communities to drive reductions in homelessness across the country. The team that I'm a part of, our public affairs and development team, is also focused on shifting the political and public opinion landscape in order to build the support for the policy changes that we need to see happen to support your work and to support the people that you serve and work with. Things like advocating for more supportive and community housing, and advocating against harmful legislation that criminalizes homelessness. So today in our presentation, we'll go through some of the challenges that we've heard from shelter operators, and we'll give you a chance to vote in another poll about which are some of the most pressing for you. And we will throughout be also going to Cindy and Darren for their direct experience on how these pieces apply. We'll talk a little bit about what are the narratives we need to shift, understanding who you need to influence and strategies to reach them, developing some simple messages that we found work to reach people. And in addition, at the very end, we'll cover a few kind of tips and tricks for local media and crisis communications. So first off, I'm going to give you another poll, which is it would be great to hear from you about what is the biggest challenge you face building public support for housing-focused, low-barrier shelters. And if you have other ones, if you vote other on here, please feel free to type in the chat what the other challenge you're facing is. But these are some of the ones that we had heard in terms of active local opposition, not even really knowing where to start, just feeling like the whole situation's kind of overwhelming and don't really have the capacity to focus on that. Seeing some results coming in. Okay. Awesome. And as mentioned, feel free to type in the chat at any time if there's options that we aren't offering on the poll. In terms of how we're going to address these things through the rest of the presentation, if you're one of the folks that doesn't know where to start, we got you. That's what we're here for today. And if you're feeling overwhelmed and don't have time and capacity, we're going to break things down into simple tips and strategies that you can scale for your situation. We're also going to show you concrete examples of materials and resources that have been produced, and we'll be sending them out with the slides after the session, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And in terms of community opposition, yeah, the struggle is real. And will be, a few of the things that we've heard. We're seeing increased unsheltered homelessness in many parts of the country, increasingly visible homelessness. And this has really heightened some community concerns and like the spread of myths and stigma. I know you all know very well what are the myths and the stigma that people hold. That's a really big challenge, but we do have some strategies that work. Just for example, take the myth of if you provide more services and housing, if you expand what you're doing, this is going to make the problem worse. We will see more of this in our community and people not wanting that in their neighborhood. We have facts and arguments that counter that. We're going to talk about how do we communicate that effectively. So yeah, so again, if you have other challenges, please post in the chat. And next I'm going to go to Cindy and Darren to talk a little bit about their examples, and we'll have a good conversation. So first off, I have a question for Cindy to lead us off, which is if you could describe the situation that Main Street Project recently experienced, and the challenge that you faced in terms of local pushback.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me here today. Really grateful to be here. Just a little bit of background information about Main Street Project. We're a homeless serving organization in Winnipeg, and we have a number of programs and services that we offer to support the community, including our mobile outreach program that primarily supports folks living unsheltered. We do have one of the largest emergency shelters in Winnipeg. And then we also offer housing to the community, low barrier housing first, supported housing. And so all of those are really important for the story that I'm about to tell you. Also, the province of Manitoba earlier this year launched their plan to end chronic homelessness in Manitoba. It's called Your Way Home, and we're a very important active partner in that plan, in that strategy to end homelessness in the city and in Manitoba. So that's also important to know as well. This just happened a couple of weeks ago, so it's still pretty fresh, but we recently experienced a lot of negative and misleading media information related to our outreach team supporting a couple of individuals. We had to move a couple of people, two people, from one spot to a different spot on the riverbank. So they were unsheltered at the time. They're housed now, thankfully. But in moving these folks, a resident in a community nearby saw what was happening, and I believe he recorded a video from like possibly a security camera in his yard or something to that effect. And he approached his neighborhood association in the area about his concern that we were setting up a new encampment in their neighborhood, which, wasn't the case. The reality of our work, and I'm sure many other folks who do outreach work understand that we have to move people all the time, and there's lots of different reasons for that, fire, flood, bylaws, private property, that kind of thing. So it's not out of the ordinary for us to move folks who are living unsheltered to a safer spot. The Residents Association, again, really misinterpreted our actions, and they had sent us an angry letter about what we were doing, setting up this new encampment. And they CC'd a lot of important people to our organization on the letter. So they included the mayor, the premier of the province, the shadow minister for homelessness and Homelessness Winnipeg, the Winnipeg Foundation, and United Way Winnipeg, which are all really important funders of our organization. The media got a hold of the letter, unfortunately, and what followed after that was several days of pretty heavy media scrutiny about our work in the situation. Again, it was really misrepresented and misinterpreted, unfortunately. The media did, approach us for comment, of course, and we are generally very careful and measured when dealing with the media, particularly in a crisis like this, and determined that the best course of action for us in this situation would be not to comment in the media about this. We actually thought, that it would go away. Like, we didn't really think it would pick up that much traction because there were other things happening at the time. So the king was in Canada at the time, and also major forest fires were erupting in Manitoba. So those things really should have eclipsed this story, but unfortunately, I think the story started on a Thursday and lasted throughout the next week until, I don't know, maybe the Wednesday or Thursday. And again, the main narrative was that our organization is responsible for setting up new encampments and that we weren't working in alignment with the new provincial plan to end homelessness in the province, which isn't true. It was really difficult as we couldn't really speak to the specifics of what happened in the situation. We really needed to protect our relationships with our funders, and had we gone into the media and provided comments, that would have damaged a lot of those really critical relationships.
Thanks for sharing that. So you were saying that like protecting your funders was a key objective or driver of what you're thinking about in response. Was there any other objectives, or was that kind of your main focus in how you were responding?
Yeah, the main focus was really just to manage our relationships with our key partners in this work. Without those relationships, we can't do this work. So we wanted to make sure that instead of going into the media and trying to explain, something that's pretty complex, we just wanted to work with folks directly. So again, those key stakeholders that we have, and make sure that those relationships were good and stayed on a good path. We did respond to the neighborhood association via letter, and we thanked them for their concerns and let them know we can't really speak to the specifics of this situation. We did invite them to a meeting in person to talk about it. We generally find that having these kind of hard conversations goes much better in person instead of through letters. And then we did send some information about our work in terms of an education series that we did and some other materials. And yeah, we really wanted to focus on not participating in media, but rather working with the people who are most important to our organization directly. And it was very challenging because the stories in the media about our work were just not true. And so it can be very difficult when you're seeing, untrue stories being printed about you. And it's a terrible thing to experience, but we really couldn't do much to counter that, just at risk of damaging important relationships. And part of what we did to help navigate some of this is we consulted with a crisis communications person. And one of the first things she did is she reminded us that it's going to be okay. And that was really helpful to hear, because when you're so immersed in this work and in a really big crisis like this, you can kind of forget that, oh, actually, like, it will be okay. So that was really good. And then she talked us through our approach on, not directly commenting to the media, but rather working with our partners directly. And she said that was the right thing to do. And then she gave us some really good tips for moving forward as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And we will be showing some of the examples of the pieces that you produced a little bit later on, but really appreciate the intro to the situation you were facing. Darren, your two organizations also recently collaborated to identify and bring online new housing for people to live in living in encampments. And this was, I believe, part of the provincial plan that you referenced. Darren, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of an overview of that and the challenges that you anticipated in building public support.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this initiative was a part of the province's Your Way Home plan, and it's a building located in our West End that it's bringing 41 units online for folks exiting encampments. And when this opportunity arose, we saw this as a great opportunity to collaborate with Main Street Project. So we've been building our capacity on the property management side of things and acquiring new buildings. An MSP, or Main Street Project, they specialize and do just absolutely wonderful work and outreach. So given that these are folks coming from encampments into this housing, that's less our wheelhouse, as we don't do the outreach. So We have good friends across the street that we created a meaningful partnership with, and worked with the province in solidifying that partnership and the funding needed for this initiative. So yeah, I think in general, people in Manitoba are encouraged by the direction of the sector and the government, in particular the Your Way Home strategy. So the challenges that we saw leading into this from a communication standpoint actually were not what you'd usually expect, I would say, and that general public support for the work that we're doing and Main Street Project is doing, and in the direction of the provincial government is there. Where the challenges were in that the provincial plan was laid out, but possibly, anyways, folks within the sector had a lot of questions, in particular with folks coming from encampments around human rights and such, and enforcement around how these initiatives were going to roll out. So, and they were quite vocal, the sector partners as well in the media, which then in turn can start to shift the general public narrative, which I think was in a positive place, and start to sort of show a divide within the sector as well. So we approached that differently in a bit more of a personal approach, and that these are sector partners who we very much respect, and what they're doing and is holding folks accountable, which is very, very important. But we just wanted to have some conversations to see if we could do that in a more productive way, and to understand that we were working together as a group as well too, to make sure that this initiative in particular and all our initiatives moving forward it was being done in a good way with respect for human rights, from a housing focus and housing first approach, as well as following best practice as well too, and knowing that we have the subject matter experts in Main Street Project working with these folks, and working also informing folks that the government, the timing of when sort of they rolled the plan out a bit to some of the consultations and that had happened is what partly brought this into question, I think. And so the key for us there in these challenges was to, instead of creating a public fight or a public debate, or is probably a better way of putting it, we had some personal conversations to help instill that confidence and to get folks on board in a good way, because it's important that folks from our sector and advocates for our sector and the folks that we serve do hold people accountable. So we want to be able to share and instill the confidence that the work that we're doing is being done well and right. But the public platform is not the place for this. So we had some very meaningful conversations in private. And I think we landed on a good place where by the time we also collaborated in the public announcements, there wasn't a lot of lead up publicly because of the nature of who we're housing, and we kept the location private as well too. But so that it was sort of work behind the scenes to get everybody on board and confident in what we were doing and the initiative that was about to go online.
Great, thanks so much, Darren. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you built that support and had those conversations with folks a little bit later. So one thing that I heard there was that there were some, in both examples, there were these initial conversations where you figured out, what's the goal and what do we want to avoid? What do we want to try to make happen? And that's something that just understanding your objectives at the beginning of the process is really important. Otherwise, you end up kind of acting without a sense of direction. And also, when you have limited capacity, it also helps you focus, say like, okay, this isn't the priority we're pursuing right now. So just a few examples of objectives that you could advance with the strategies we're talking about today. There's, shifting the narrative around homelessness in shelters with a particular audience in your community. For example, the neighborhood group that Cindy mentioned, or local media, building relationships and growing a foundation of support with a particular audience. or in response to a crisis, limiting the negative impact and rebuilding support. And in terms of the piece around the audience, we're going to come back to, who are those key audiences you might need to influence. And you can have multiple objectives, but would recommend you start with one or two, particularly if you have limited capacity, just determining what is the actual most important objective in this moment, and start from there. It is better to focus your energy and do one thing really well in terms of your media relations and your relationship building and those pieces, and then grow from there. And if you have other goals and objectives in your cases, please feel free to share in the chat. So segueing to the audience question, I'm going to throw up another Slido poll for you, which is, in your case, who is most important for you to influence to achieve your goals? And feel free to vote for all that apply, but would encourage you to try to focus on a couple to start with. And the reason that we put this up there and trying to get folks thinking about it is that it's important to figure out who your audience is in order to refine your message strategy. For example, you're going to talk differently to, say, another service provider in the sector that understands the system already than you would compared to talking to your mayor or your local MP. I know someone pointed out in the chat, folks in government just don't even understand what we do. So you have to start from a different baseline than you would with someone who's had more exposure to your work or works in the sector. And it would be a different conversation again if you have someone who's a concerned parent that lives like down the block. So awesome. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of stuff about neighborhood residents, which is, not great that it's an issue, but good in terms of that we have a lot of content about how to work with neighborhood residents. Local council as well. We'll get a little bit into that, and businesses, other service providers, and local media. So thanks very much for that. So we will go kind of through those key audiences and give a few tips and tricks for each one. But before that, wanted to just give a quick overview of what's messaging and why is it important. Because I think when people hear messaging, they tend to think, this isn't something I do. But actually, messaging is just having a conversation that includes a message. So we do that every day. If you even just talk to a colleague that works for another sector organization and describe the work of your organization, you are messaging something. So it's about like, how do you integrate key points in those conversations and in the more public facing work that you're doing. So we're going to talk about basically how do you make sure your messaging is focused, strategic, and effective. And I'll share some insights that we learned from some research that Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness did last fall on what messages resonate with average Canadians about how we talk about homelessness. So in general, key messages are simple, focused statements to guide and shape conversations. They capture the essence of what you want to communicate about your initiative, your campaign, your project. They capture, in general, the current situation, the solution you're calling for, and why it matters to your audience. So for example, what is at stake if you're saying the current situation is a problem, there's been a problem, here's the solution we're calling for, what's at stake if the problem continues for this audience, what positive change will this achieve for your audience if things go in the direction that you're advocating for. And it's helpful to have a few short examples or data to support your message. We'll go a little bit more into that because I know that's sometimes challenging, but the like data and statistics aren't necessarily the message itself, but it's there to back up the message that you're talking about. And good key messages are short, simple, and accessible. The audience needs to understand them, and your supporters and your colleagues and the folks in your circle, in your sphere, need to be able to internalize them and also have conversations that make similar points. So a message is generally like 1 or 2 sentences. In general, you want it to be repeatable. So it's different from like a slogan or a tagline. It's not like an advertising slogan that's like the same 3 words. But it's like a sentence that describes the concept and the key uh like direction you want to go. And we have some examples coming up. You want it to be memorable and engaging. So again, kind of, going back to that piece about making sure it's relevant to the audience, and ideally being able to connect to them emotionally. So I mentioned we had takeaways from the polling and focus groups that CAH did last fall across the country. And so things that we learned, and this has been reinforced in other research about what connects with people when you're talking about homelessness. One thing is starting from a place of hope. In general, we found people want a solution and they want to believe things can be better. In they like you can tap into their compassion. They don't necessarily have the words or the context, and they're operating from a place of just like feeling like the problem is too big, or they're seeing challenges in their neighborhood, and they are influenced by messages that are going on in your local media, from your local politicians, from their neighbors, about, okay, maybe the problem is your shelter, and not the problem is this bigger systemic issue. So we found that the word home elicits strong emotions of connection and community, safety and security and comfort, more than like housing. And that people react well to language that humanizes people experiencing homelessness. So talking about things like, we're there for our neighbors when they need us. Using us like we are a community, and that includes people experiencing homelessness, people that are using shelter services, and not creating that us and them. We heard like a lot from people in focus groups. People said things like, everyone has a story. They're people too. Most people know someone who has at least come close to experiencing homelessness, and people see the housing crisis around them every day. So using this like accessible language that lifts up shared values, and avoiding like overly jargony terms. And this is where I get into the sell the brownie, not the recipe. And now I want to eat a brownie looking at this photo. But the point there is essentially like, if you're going to go and you're going to buy a dessert, you are not necessarily sold by the fact that someone like outlines for you, this contains X grams of enriched bleached flour. It's like, what is the brownie? What is the value add? What is the reason that this person should care about what you're doing? Martin Luther King Jr. was not known for saying, I have a multi-bulleted list of policy proposals. It's like thinking about, as shelter operators, funders, advocates, how are you, what is your brownie? What is the value add? Like, how are you supporting the people that you work with, but also those audiences that you're trying to reach? What is the relevance to them? And while like people have that baseline of compassion we can tap into, connecting it to their goals and objectives and the issues they're raising is also important. And I'll just mention, when we're talking about language, there's a couple language pieces that I've heard some shelters exploring. So just for consideration, is Darren, I know that you folks have done some work around like using terms like behavior-based interventions to try to establish like terms that have been less politicized than harm reduction. Also, some folks are using like high access shelters instead of low barrier shelters, framing it in a positive way that immediately kind of connects to here's how this is supportive. If you want a solution in your community, then you need to have high access. So just a couple, like some food for thought, that is not brownies, sadly, but hopefully interesting. I didn't even put up that little thing, sell the brownie, not the recipe. Okay, there we go. Hopefully point taken. I'm sorry, I just made you look at the photo without that text. So next up, we're going to go through the specific audiences that we identified and talk about tips to connect with the groups you might be trying to reach. And regardless of which audience you're trying to work with or trying to reach, the best way to drive home a message is with real human examples. We see this, we know it works partly because we see it in the opposition to our work too. I know that just last week I saw like a news article that was basically a local schoolgirl is scared about a new shelter near her school in Mississauga. And so these are like the stories that are being profiled about that are in opposition to the work that we're trying to do. And but the positive side is that it's also possible to generate the same interest and emotion and to sway the public narrative by connecting to the humanity of the situation. And so I just threw up there a couple of examples of ways that you can do this, because I know not everyone is able to share direct testimony of people you serve. And, you may have safety issues, other types of confidentiality. You have to be really sensitive to the power dynamics. But there are things you can do, like anonymizing stories, doing that like through, directly working with someone to share their specific story, but doing that under a different name, things like that. In addition, you can sort of tell stories through frontline workers and volunteers. Like the people we work with have experiences like X that are anonymizing their stories, but also providing that perspective from someone who works directly. In addition, just their stories as shelter operators can be really powerful. And local champions, highlighting the stories of neighbors and businesses, sharing how you've helped them. We've seen some folks that have been able to find a small business owner that will talk about how, like, yeah, things were a challenge, and now that the shelter is here, we have we're seeing fewer issues in front of my business, and we have a really great relationship with them. So those types of validation can be really, really helpful too. I'm seeing lots of great comments, so thanks for that. Keep them coming, folks. I'm going to go back to Cindy and Darren to talk about how you connect with neighbors. And Darren, I'm going to throw up an example in the background, but also that was a piece you produced, but wanted to ask a bit about what was the message that you emphasized with the neighbors for your project?
Yeah, so we started with this last year where, we just a lot of our neighbors, where we are at 300 Princess here in Winnipeg, it's mostly businesses around us. And they're experiencing a lot of challenges with the folks we serve and that as well, whether it be vandalism to sometimes even just simply scaring customers and that. But so we went around and basically started just having conversations door to door to see, just to get a bit of a temperature check with everybody to see where they're at. And what we found very quickly was that even though we seem to always hear that people are angry or have some problem with the work that we're doing or whatever, is that once we started these conversations, they really, really just wanted to be heard. And so what we did actually is then we decided to have sort of a town hall, for lack of a better term here. And so we went around door to door and basically we said, we want to hear you. And we'd like to have a conversation to see how we can be good neighbors and that we can be partners within our neighborhood. And so a lot of folks really welcomed the idea to the coming in for the town hall and having the conversation. And really the main message that we started with was listening to them. Of course, a lot of folks probably had a lot of opinions in that right or wrong, or at times even offensive, likely in that it was just opening that dialogue was the key thing before getting into the messaging and listening to their concerns. And so, and then acknowledging their concerns. But then at that point, everybody was really open to having just an honest conversation where we were really able to, I think, just have a good conversation where it also allowed for them to open their minds up as well too. And I don't think that we didn't necessarily have to use special language or anything, but we were then able to engage in a meaningful conversation that allowed for understanding from both sides. And this document here really is a product of that, and that we understood, we maybe had a better understanding of some of the challenges that our neighbors were facing. And then we were able to create this to help sort of strengthen that relationship, or even in some cases, just simply establish that relationship. So I don't know that it was necessarily a messaging thing as much as listening and having just an honest, open dialogue. And in that honesty as well, too, like the work that we do and everybody here does, like it makes sense from so many perspectives, social, economic, and just being good human beings. And most of the neighbors, that's essentially at the core what they are when you can peel back some of the layers of anger or frustration or even fear at times as well too. So that would be the biggest lesson that we would take. And so this has proven to be quite helpful for sure. And it's strengthened those relationships. Now, the key to this as well too is knowing that you can't just have this conversation, then see you later sort of thing. Like, and this document also allows for ongoing conversations. And then also, I think what it allows for is better outcomes for the folks who access our services as well too, instead of getting into an argument or having one of our neighbors not treat them very well either. This is creating better outcomes and where better solutions are being created. So yeah.
Great, thanks for that. I really like the points that you made about it being an ongoing conversation, and how the start of that conversation has to start by a place of meeting folks where they're at and identifying, like doing a listening exercise.
And I think an important aspect to remember too as well, because it's easy to get there even in our own frustrations where people simply just are really struggling to get it. It's important not to shame people no matter where they are at in those conversations. We may agree or disagree, and we may continue to disagree on certain things, but just sometimes what I see coming out of our sector, even other folks' work, is when you shame folks that aren't in the know or don't understand, that's just closing the door to that conversation. So by just being willing to listen and not shaming them and coming at it from a positive perspective or opportunity to have positive outcomes, I think is so important.
Absolutely. Cindy, I'm going to put up a resource that you folks created, and wondering if you could tell us a little bit about I mean, you could talk specifically about this piece that you produced, but also, you know, how have you been working, or what are the audiences that you were trying to respond to in your situation, and a little bit more on what worked and what didn't.
Sure. So in this specific situation, we really identified that our major audiences were, again, our funders and our key partners in this work. We didn't identify that the neighborhood association was the most important audience. They were, you know, someone we needed to respond to them, so we did that via letter, and then. But in terms of like those really important ongoing in-person conversations or over the phone conversations, it was our funders that were the main audience that we needed to keep in touch with about this situation. And then also our staff, our outreach staff were a really important audience in this situation. And I think sometimes we forget about those folks as a major stakeholder in this work. So, you know, our outreach staff come to this work with so much heart, and a lot of them have lived experience, so it's very personal to them. And it was their work essentially that was on blast in the media, so we needed to make sure that we were keeping in touch with them about the situation and updating them as it was ongoing. So our executive director, you know, emails or was in touch with our staff right away about the situation and explained, you know, what was happening, and shared the letter from the Residents Association, as well as our response to the letter, and then kept them updated of the situation as well. And then the outreach manager, you know, he kept in touch with his staff in person and made sure that they felt really supported in the work that they do, and made sure that they know that we have their back in this situation. In part of our response to the neighborhood association, we did, we thanked them for their concerns. We invited them for an in-person meeting, and then we also shared some educational materials. And I'll be honest, it didn't land well with them, particularly the educational material part of it, because they felt like we had given them homework to do, when, you know, I think they really, as Darren has said, they really just wanted to be heard. And so we definitely still have some work to do with those folks. I think we're still hoping to have an in-person meeting. We have taken an education approach before when people have had concerns about our work, and it has worked. So we kind of, you know, we did that again. I think assuming to some degree that it would, once they read the materials that we provided, they would understand why our team did what they did and why the approach was that approach. But again, it didn't work for them. And so that was a lesson learned for us. And it's important to be nimble and flexible and understand that, you know, we tried this, it didn't work. What else can we do? So that's kind of where we're at now. This piece on the screen here is a door knocker piece that we provide. You know, if our outreach team is going to an area where an encampment or a tent has popped up, where maybe there hasn't been that presence before and our team hasn't been to that neighborhood before, we want to make sure that we're reaching out to the neighbors close by and just introducing who we are and what the purpose of our work is, and then providing ability for folks to contact us with concerns or questions, and really just keeping those lines of communication open. You know, folks are concerned when a tent pops up in their neighborhood, or an encampment pops up where there hasn't been one before, and that's totally a justifiable concern, and we want to support the concerned neighbors and help them understand what we do and how we can work with them and facilitate good neighbor relationships.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that. So I heard a bunch of awesome strategies in there, and want to you know, cover off a few more that folks may want to consider for reaching your audience. So you know, we talked a bit about residents and businesses, and here's just a few tactics that you can use. There was a Darren and Cindy, I think you both talked a little bit about like door to door, getting on the agenda for meetings, you know, by asking, can we come and present at a meeting of your association, or there's other types of meetings that you could look to attend, such as, a local business association meeting, a local union meeting, and just helping to demystify the work that you're doing, and being like accessible for people to ask questions, and for you to hear where folks are coming from. There's community liaison committees are something that some folks have explored. Open houses, which is something that can apply for multiple audiences, or tours, like guided tours, as well as complaints driven processes. So that piece that Darren, you shared about, what do you do if there's a problem, and if there's no if people don't know, like, what am I supposed to do if there's a problem, then they will invent their own channels, and sometimes those are not helpful. Sometimes it is taking something to the media, and so making sure that folks feel like, okay, I understand what to do, and that people are meaningfully addressing the concerns that I'm raising, basically validating the concerns and then turning them into allies. So then the other thing is, so we were talking about the piece about showing responsiveness, and education is really important, but like starting from a place of hearing them out a little bit, and responding in a way that's not condescending, that is offering helpful information, but also speaking to them in a place where they're at. So being responsive to one thing Grant just shared was like the idea of being responsiveness to what is happening to start, because if you if you go to, just say, City Hall hasn't fixed a pothole on your street, to go with like an analogous situation, and they go, well, it's because we're really backlogged. Like, that's going to go some of the way, but they want to know, okay, well, what are you going to do to fix this? So being able to show that you are listening to the concern, and being responsive, while also and then like having to show that you actually are doing something. Of course, like, this is with reasonable things, and but trying to get folks in a conversation where you can understand, and if you can't do one thing that people are looking for, like, maybe there's something else that could happen that can be helpful. For sector partners and service providers, this is something where we've heard that some shelter operators are hearing that, like, people that would previously come into the shelter and offer services in this shelter are like saying they're now afraid to come, and things like that, where it's impacting the relationship with people that you used to work really closely with. So again, like, tactics to demystify the work. You can have an AMA as an Ask Me Anything, shadowing, and aligning health and safety practices. Again, like, understanding, like, tangibly what is driving the concern or the fear in this situation. Is there something that we could be doing differently that would resolve this issue? And then all levels of government. So this was a piece I saw comments in there about challenges people were facing with just lack of political support, and politicians not really knowing, and probably political staff not knowing exactly what you actually do. This is something, having worked a lot with all levels of government, part of it is like there's staff changes and moves around a lot, and people are not always elected for being policy experts. Starting with some like basic education, but also being conscious of the message that they will find helpful. So one thing that is important is to not just summarize the problem, but also what are the solutions. And that doesn't need to be like really detailed, but to be able to kind of point to some general areas. In addition to being able to present to them what are the benefits of following your asks or the support you're looking for. For example, if you in the situation of Ontario and the Safer Municipalities Act, which is effectively a piece of legislation criminalizing homelessness, a key message to government is we know this won't work. Like it's not just wrong, it will also not work. We have a lot of research and data to back that up. And that is, it goes to, if they don't care that it's wrong, hopefully they care that it won't work because they're trying to achieve a particular objective there. So backing your message up with some data and examples can be really helpful. So those, you know, if you're able to have validators, neighbors, and businesses being able to show that lower barrier means fewer incidents in the neighborhood, and sharing who you're working with to bolster credibility, all of that can be really helpful. And there's different types of approaches you can take. You can go for individual meetings with elected officials or staff, presentation to council. If other folks have ones they've tried, feel free to put them in the chat. Those are just a few things for government. And so I know we're running tight on time, so I'm just going to go through a few media relations things, and then we'll turn it over for questions. A few tips for proactive media relations, and then we'll talk a little bit about crisis communications. The most important thing with any audience is building relationships. So how you do this tangibly with media relations, one is make a list of the outlets that cover local news and note which journalists are covering your issues. And I know someone suggested you could ask to meet with your editorial board of your local paper. Some smaller outlets, it would probably just be a meeting with the editor. And you could just basically do like an informational meeting that you're not necessarily pitching a story, but you want them to know here's the services that we provide. And if there's stories on these things, these are the types of, this is the type of content we could provide. Need to recognize the difference between a reporter and an opinion columnist. Opinion columnists, if they're reaching out for comment, they may have a bit of a different agenda. But relationships with both can be really helpful. In some places, opinion columnists have more weight than the news stories. So having that there. In addition, having supporting data again is really helpful. Media outlets today, with the challenges we've seen with the shift to digital news, rarely have budget for research, and there is an incredible drive for stories that will get clicks, and that often involves stories that portray conflict. If you want a kind of more thoughtful piece, or a piece that includes your take in a way that you know, people are going to appreciate and see as backed up, then being able to do a little bit of that groundwork for the journalists that don't have the resources to do the research on their own is really helpful. You'll find that often, like if you put something out, sometimes local media will just basically print a media statement as a news story almost as is, because they need content and they don't have the capacity to produce enough on their own. In terms of pitching your story, when you have a story, you need to know your hook. What makes your story unique or timely? There's a big challenge. I mean, Cindy, you were talking about the situation with like, this should have been drowned out by fires and the king and things like that. And you can imagine that maybe if there hadn't been a crisis and you had just been trying to get out like a semi-positive story about the work you were doing, it may not have cut through the king and cut through all of that stuff. So what are you tying it to? If there's like a local event that's happening, if there's a milestone, something that makes it timely, is generally really helpful when you're pitching a story. Keep it concise and include supporting materials, and identify the human stories and who will be able to speak on the record. We talked a little bit about that earlier. So Cindy, you have a media toolkit that we'll also send out, and wanted to just ask in your case with media, if you had been able to foresee the situation, is there anything you would have done differently, or what are the kind of key takeaways that you would suggest for folks on this webinar?
Yeah, I think it's, again, we couldn't really comment on the specific situation in the media, but having good relationships with those media folks is really important to me and to our organization. We rely on media heavily to get our story out, and in a different situation, of course. So keeping in touch with them when they're sending their requests, being responsive is such an important part of keeping those relationships good. And I think what can happen sometimes is when there's a communications crisis and the media is involved, folks who may not have a lot of experience with media will get a request and then maybe be afraid to respond and say, even to say no comment, or we're not commenting, or we decline to comment. It's good to respond and say that you're not commenting, and why, if you can say that. So just making sure to be responsive and be mindful of their deadlines and that kind of thing. It's usually a very fast turnaround. Their requests will come in the morning or early afternoon, and then their deadlines are usually 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. So just keeping those things in mind to manage those good relationships. Something that, I wish, and I think our team would agree, that we could have done a bit differently is, this isn't our first rodeo with, a crisis communication situation. And we experienced a pretty heavy media experience last summer, and it would have been good if at that time the takeaway that we had there was to consult with a crisis communications person then, and build a really solid plan for when and if this comes up again. This work can be very controversial for some folks, causes a lot of heightened emotions, and just having a really good PR and crisis communications plan in place would have been probably helpful for us during this situation a few weeks ago. Thankfully, we have that now. We have the crisis comms person on speed dial. She was really great to work with, and really helpful. And we've built out a really solid PR plan for if something like this happens again, and I'm sure it will. This work is hard, and people have a lot of thoughts on it. The media toolkit here is something that I worked on in partnership with a sector communications working group a number of years ago. So it is a bit older of a document, and I think it would need some updating, but having something like this on hand to provide to media is helpful, and I think has been helpful in the past. I think, we've talked a bit about media outlets not having a lot of capacity, and just being able to provide them tools on reporting on homelessness and encampments and that kind of thing is really helpful. And I think that they do appreciate that.
Great, thanks so much. So just quickly before we turn it over for questions, I'm going to put on the screen some crisis communications tips. Cindy mentioned a bunch of the things on this list. I'll just quickly flag the need to respond promptly. Like, don't ghost a journalist if they reach out. Even if you're not able to respond, you can still say, like, thanks so much for asking. What's your deadline? Can I get more information about like how this information will be used? And I need to connect back on my end and give them like an estimate of when you might be able to get back to them. That's super important. And in addition, if you are asked for comment and you can't, for any reason, if you're able to then offer something you can do to support. Again, this is like where they're coming from as an audience, is they need to put out a story. So, maybe you can't comment on specifically what happened in this situation, but maybe you're able to offer an interview a week from now that would be on an interesting topic, or maybe you can, share like calmly like why you can't provide details, and then yeah, provide an alternative. So here's what we can do. So I will turn the floor over to Grant to get into questions. And again, just thanks so much everyone for joining us. I'm going to also put on the screen a slide with a QR code if you want to sign up for emails from CAH if you're not already on our list. And yeah, look forward to your questions.
All right. Thanks, Jara. Thanks, Cindy and Darren, for everything over the past hour 15. That was great. We do have some questions that have trickled in. I think the first one that's from Amanda might actually be one that I might be able to tackle, because it's talking about what are the characteristics of a non-housing focused shelter. Would every shelter, whether accurate or not, say that it is housing focused? So I appreciate that's more just speaking in general terms around housing focused shelter approach, as opposed to specific to today's topic. But I will just kind of answer quite quickly, right? Is the big distinction between a housing focused shelter and a traditional model of emergency shelter is that housing focused shelters really see their shelters as the beginning of a process of rehousing someone as quickly and safely as possible, and not as a destination, right? So traditional shelters the primary goal tends to be like provide temporary, like immediate safety and provide basic needs. And housing focused shelters do that as well, but they see that their primary goal is to like help that individual or family exit homelessness as quickly as possible through housing placement, and try to make that stay as brief as possible, or potentially avoid that stay altogether if someone can be safely diverted. And so if anybody's interested, please have a look at the housing focused shelter manual that's on our website that kind of talks about the core service orientation and services that align with housing focused shelters. You may find valuable. I think also too, in the August of last year webinar that is hosted on the website, the link to it, we had a leader from Siloam Mission talk about practical ways that they applied core service orientations from a housing focused shelter model into their day-to-day work at Siloam Mission. But yes, a shelter could call themselves housing focused and not be. There are core pieces like, do you practice diversion? Do you talk about housing as soon as possible after intake? Do you have staff who engage people in rehousing efforts in a very intentional way in your space? And do you have a relationship with your local by name data and coordinated access systems? Things like that really is what differentiates a traditional emergency shelter model to a housing focused one. We have a question here for Cindy, which I think was maybe from something that you touched on early in the presentation. Was there an opportunity to work together with the funders on messaging, so creating joint responses to your crisis situation? I'm guessing that you were dealing with a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I love this question, and it's something that we're implementing moving forward. So when we get media requests about encampments, about housing, or about the provincial Your Way Home plan, so I'll share the request internally, but then the plan is to also reach out to the partners at the province and also at the city, because the city is very involved in the plan as well. And to just say, we've received this request. Are you planning to comment on it? Here's what we're thinking, and then working to align our messaging that way. I love that question. Thanks so much for that. It's really important that we are aligning our messaging, and we definitely want to get away from saying no comment or not commenting, even in really tough situations. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing working forward, and we have that great new process built into place for that.
Great. Darren, there was a question from Stephanie about neighbors reaching out with concerns, but she said your document helped answer her question. So that's great.
I could speak a little bit more to it.
Sure.
I'm glad the document helped, but I think something that we've learned as well too is it's not always possible, in particular like situation Cindy's talking about where a crisis arises, but the more you can get ahead of things with pre-work, the better. And that can vary through, you know, creating media stories, public education, community education, all of that, but just constant communication and engaging folks ahead of time, it's going to make it. I get the challenges that Stephanie's mentioning as well too, that, you know, sometimes the open conversations don't help, but it's that getting ahead of it and then the openness to listen, but then also finding creative ways to engage folks as well too. So for example, we opened seniors housing in an area that sort of, I guess, it has a lot more wealthier folks and has seniors condos there. So we again sort of had a local campaign in that area as well too, to raise awareness. I think some of the points that Jared brings up is the more data and information that you can provide ahead of time really helps, but also with the outcomes, and those outcomes as well, like I was mentioning earlier, not just social, but the economic outcomes actually are there as well too. And that sometimes will relate to some of those people that are harder nuts to crack, but just finding creative ways to engage. A good example would be that seniors housing facility that we opened. So from the get-go, we got folks involved where they were wanting to come volunteer and start book clubs with the folks. Or even last Christmas, they approached us and said, hey, Christmas time, where are they going to get Christmas gifts from? And so we started a conversation, and the local Seniors Condo Association actually gathered all the gifts and gift wrapped them, and then came and understood there was privacy involved, so they weren't there for the handing out of the gifts, but sort of had a staff moment where kind of got them a win, I guess, you know, for lack of a better term as well too. And that just gets that sort of emotional buy-in as well too, which can help with the harder conversations.
I think that's one, getting ahead of it really critical. Like, I appreciate you mentioning that. And the other piece that I like from what you just shared was, we don't want to lose sight too that, how do I put this? Under stress, people regress, including like our neighbors to our shelters and things like that. But yeah, so we might see some reactions that we don't necessarily understand or agree with. But let's not forget that we can reframe our relationship with those folks, and that a lot of those folks that are frustrated might actually truly want to help and be good neighbors with the shelter guests and find ways to help. It's just that they're overwhelmed by maybe some stuff that they're currently struggling with.
For sure.
Yeah. There is a question that someone emailed me who registered but was unable to attend today. So I want to make sure that I get their question out there so they can watch the recording later and hear it answered. So this is someone from Ottawa, where they say that one of their challenges here in Ottawa is getting a particular media outlet to be interested in the more storytelling aspect of our work. They reach out for topical news pieces. So this week it was about the dangerous heat, but rarely respond to our pitches. Their audience demographic is interested in our stories or homelessness stories in general, but we're struggling to getting their producers to respond. I know they're stretched thin, but like, how do we get producers intrigued, interested, and open to sharing? I think, Jared, you kind of hit a little bit on some of the tips for the media stuff, but Darren, I see you maybe have some thoughts around that.
Yeah, and like, so we all know the challenges that can occur working with media, and that, you know, if you just kind of throw it out to, and we have a media list and that we send releases out to, but Jared was mentioning folks that write like the editorial pieces, and they have strong followings. And if you can find a way to build relationships with some key ones in some outlets that you feel are respectable and whatnot, we hear the Winnipeg Free Press is one of our more reputable news outlets here. And so there's a fella in there that he writes editorials, and we've kind of have this ongoing relationship with him that allows, it's not, you know, we're not constantly pitching an idea. We actually, like last story that we did with him, spent like a month kind of just bouncing ideas off of each other. So the reporters are a little harder because they're on usually like day-to-day deadlines, maybe a couple days. Those editorial folks, sometimes they're building their stories for like months at a time, and there's an opportunity to start a relationship there and build something that you're going to have more control over, and probably more real estate in the actual day's news as well too.
Right. So taking advantage of being able to kind of like individualize the relationship
Yeah,
with
yeah,
that particular.
for
Okay.
sure.
Right. Anything that you wanted to add to that, Cindy?
No, I think Darren hit the nail on the head with that one for sure. Those relationships are really important to getting your stories out.
Right. Kendall has a question here where it says like, what are the most persistent myths about shelters you've encountered? And how can we counter them effectively without sounding defensive or dismissive? Oh, I love this question. Yeah, because I think I shared with the panelists in a previous role that I was in, when we'd have these delegations going to council sometimes, when we would try to like verify or refute something, we would just come off as very defensive, and then that just really kind of alienated the person that's doing the delegation. So your thoughts around that from our panel around one, what's the biggest myth you've heard or you've encountered, and how do you respond to it effectively without sounding defensive or dismissive?
I mean, I would say that some of the myths that I've come across are around, people choose to be homeless, connections to substance use addictions. And someone made a good point in the chat about some of it is like how we talk about the issues, and they were recommending, not using mental health and substance use as like one phrase, because it can make all of like mental health, substance use, and homelessness feel like they're intrinsically connected, and people make the assumption that people are homeless because of these things, as opposed to the fact that homelessness creates trauma and can cause mental health and substance use issues. But I think that it's about the tone, and like one thing that I do if I'm having a conversation with someone that I know has this stigma is, first of all, like taking a breath and resisting the urge to facto lanch them and to be like, well, research actually shows this and this and this, and to go like, well, let me tell you a little bit about my experience and some of the people that I work with, and going to those human stories first. Um, and you can say like, and research shows up like this is true across the board, but like in particular, this is where I'm coming from. I think that helps. People are more responsive when you are being like, look, I'm not judging you right away. I'm just sharing my perspective, and I work in this area every single day. So that would be like how to approach that myth, I would suggest.
I can speak to this a bit. It's honestly sometimes very difficult to not feel defensive and then to come across that way. This work is so important to all of us, and it's really personal for a lot of us. But like Jara said, taking a breath, just kind of refocusing. If I'm doing an in-person presentation and people are asking questions that I feel like may not be in good faith, just taking a moment, thanking them for their question, attempting to be very disarming in my response. I find that helps me calm down, and then I'm able to respond in a better way, again, in like good faith, and make sure that I'm helping them have their question answered in a good way, and not making them feel judged for their answer. But it can be hard sometimes because this work is very emotional. So yeah.
I also try to think about like when you're talking about a group situation like that, how is what I'm going to say land with the rest of the people in this room who may not have that view, and by approaching it as calm, empathetic, compassionate about the folks that you work with, as well as not jumping down the person's throat even if what they said was not cool, and then it's for the other people there that maybe don't have an opinion yet, more than it is for even that person.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I appreciate that too, is that you're also there to potentially influence the folks that didn't ask the question, who are just open to being influenced in a particular direction. What was that term that you used at the start there, Jara? Can you repeat that?
Backdolanch. Uh,
Backdolanch. Okay.
That's yeah, when you want to heap them with all of your facts and I hope that will change their mind.
All right.
And yeah, maybe not the best starting point. But just a couple other myths really quickly that come up are shelters make my neighborhood unsafe, or will increase visible homelessness. The like whole if we build it, they will come. That you hear this particularly in smaller communities that, well, if we have a service, then all these other areas are going to send all their folks here. And we again have facts that counter that. Like it's people are already experiencing these issues, and this will help decrease the visibility. It will help increase the safety. It will make sure your neighbors have a place to call home, and that it's about caring for them. And so um there's that piece of connecting back to that, but again starting from a place of not feel it like coming across as I think I'm smarter than you.
Right. Um, Yeah, I think I'm just very mindful of the time. One of the things that I'll kind of add to that, and then maybe we can kind of say our goodbyes and wrap up is I hope what we're learning from today too is that there is no like silver bullet or like one thing that really kind of magically works for all situations. There are strategies, there's tips and tricks, there's paths that we can go down that we know are more effective than others, but we can't expect it to work 100% all the time. So it might be a combination of efforts at producing a combination of different results and being okay with trying those different things and then measuring and trying to make improvements to your approach over time as kind of a bit of an iterative process. Um, I feel like this could be like a multi-part course that we could do. I mean, obviously, we have people who have entire degrees and professions over it. So trying to fit as much as we can in 90 minutes seems impossible, and it is. So I will make sure to send out all the resources that were shared today, the recording, the PDF of the slide deck. The other thing that I'm going to include is I developed real quickly a poster that's just do's and don'ts about talking to upset neighbors about your shelter that you can use for consideration for not just for your media folks within your organization, but for your everyday staff, street outreach workers, things like that, that will just give them simple tips and tricks around engagement when tensions might run high. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to our presenters today. Tremendous amount of work and effort went into making today happen. So I really do appreciate it. And the insights were incredible. And I'm sure lots of positive feedback here. So I can tell like it's resonating with people. So thank you. I also want to thank all the attendees, your participation in the chat, the Slido poll, sharing your thoughts, your questions. Hopefully we answered them. But this is also the beginning of a conversation, right? So we also say too that these webinars are about planting the seed. So if you have follow-up questions and you need some additional coaching or ideas about stuff, reach out to me. Happy to broker connection to folks who might be able to help. I'm assuming everybody here as presenters, panelists are open to that going forward, right? Maybe. Okay, great. Because CSTN only works if we do true peer-to-peer knowledge exchange. So I really, really appreciate that. So with that, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their Wednesday. Be well and let's end homelessness together. Thanks, everybody.